Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Gifford. Sorry I can't be here today. Here is our lesson for today. So grab some paper, something to write with. You are going to absolutely 100% going to want to have your calculator. So grab that as well. Go ahead and pause, and then when you've got all those things, come back and we will get started. All right, so here we are. This is lesson 7 in our unit on factoring and solving quadratics. And today we're going to learn something called the quadratic formula, and it's going to help us find those solutions to quadratic equations. If you've received any help from somebody within this unit, they may have talked to you about the quadratic formula. So here we are. As always, follow along with the lesson, take notes, and then when you're finished following along with the lesson, then you'll get a worksheet to do for this lesson. So we do have a few vocabulary terms to cover today. And if you haven't done so yet, go ahead and draw that line, kind of 1/3, 2/3. And then our first term is quadratic equation. And just remember at any given point, if you need, obviously this is the great part about a recorded video lesson, pause the video lesson, rewind, play it at your own speed so you get the information that you need. So quadratic equation is our first term. And here it is, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Again, we've already been working with quadratics. We've worked a lot with the a, b, and the c. We've just started working with the 0 part. Now, we know that the quadratic formula, like I said, is something that we're going to learn today. And it is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, you can sing that to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. If you go into Schoology and click on the slides, and then you'll see this link. It is the quadratic formula song. I will just briefly sing it to you, and then we're going to move on. X equals opposite b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Thank you very much. There you have it, quadratic formula. Again, when do we want to use this? We want to use the quadratic formula when it is not easy to solve by factoring. Up to this point, the equations that we've had have been very straightforward, relatively easy enough to use those numbers to get those factors to fill in the diamond problem and then the area model. But sometimes those numbers are just quite a bit bigger and a little bit more tedious to manage. And so we're going to use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula will work for any quadratic, but we definitely use it when it is a little more challenging to solve by factoring. So the next thing, one thing that we can use to help us figure out how many solutions there are is this thing called the discriminant. The discriminant is just that part of the quadratic formula that's the b squared minus 4ac. So the stuff under that square root symbol is what we call the discriminant. And if you just figure out the value of that expression, it will tell you how many solutions you should end up with, 2, 1, or 0. So if that, let me do it this way. So yeah, we'll go this way. All right, so if that discriminant comes up negative, which means when you plug in the b squared minus 4ac, if it gives you a negative number underneath that square root symbol, then there are going to be no solutions. And if you think about the square root, there's no way for us to do the square root of a negative number because we're looking for a number times itself that makes what's underneath it. And there isn't anything when you multiply it by itself that gives you a negative number because we know positive times a negative makes a negative. If the discriminant ends up being 0, there is going to be only one solution. If you look back at some of the problems we've done with factoring, solving by factoring, sometimes you might have seen that we got 2 answers of 3 or 5. And that's still just that one solution. And then if you end up with a positive number under that discriminant, then you will get there are 2 potential solutions. So just as a heads up, you can use that discriminant to help you in figuring out the number of solutions for each of those problems and whether or not you should actually keep working. So if you do the discriminant first and then you see it's negative, then you can stop and just say there's no solution. So knowing what we know, let's take a look at our first example. So I've got this equation, x squared minus 12x equals negative 20, and we're going to solve it using the quadratic formula. Now, the very first thing that we know is that we have to make this one side of the equation equal to 0. We can't do any factoring or anything else until that becomes a 0. So we need to get rid of it. And we know the opposite or inverse operation is to add. So we're going to add 20 to both sides, and that makes our quadratic equation become x squared minus 12x plus 20. Now, we have everything that we need in order to use the quadratic formula. X equals opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right. Here we go. The first thing that I would highly suggest is that you identify and label what your A, your B, and your C are. In this case, A, there's an imaginary, let me switch colors. There's an imaginary 1 right here, so we know that A is 1. And even though there's subtraction there, this subtraction actually belongs to 12, so B is negative 12. And then since C is here, C is plus 20. C is a positive 20. So that's what I've done there is I've identified my A, B, and my C. And once I've done that, I'm then ready to plug that information into the quadratic formula. We're solving for X. We're trying to find those solutions. So the first thing that I'm going to do is substitute everything that I have into the quadratic formula as we see it. Now, the opposite of B is positive 12, and that's because our B is negative 12. That means I need to have a positive 12 right here. This plus or minus, I'll explain that in just a moment. And then again, I've got the square root of, and then b squared, b is negative 12. And notice I've got that negative 12 inside parentheses. Folks, if you don't and you don't use those parentheses when you're solving the problem, this number, this first part's always going to be negative, but it should always be positive because you are squaring whatever b is. Okay, so b squared minus 4 times a is 1, times c, which is 20, all over 2 times 1. So again, at any given time, if you need to take a little break, make sure that you pause the video and then rewind as often as possible to get caught up with what you need. Once you get those numbers substituted in, then all you're going to do is follow the order of operations in order to get the solution that you need. So we know that the square root symbol is a grouping symbol, and I'm going to follow the order of operations. I'm going to do negative 12 squared first. That's 144. And then I'm going to multiply 4, 1, and 20, which is 80. And I'm going to multiply 2 and 1, which is 2. So the next line down on your paper, you should have x equals 12 plus or minus square root of 144 minus 80, and then all over 2. So again, each line down, we're simplifying using the order of operations as best that we can. So this next slide actually walks through the rest of this problem. Oops, let me go back. Let me go back here to this slide. I forgot we added this in. You may have noticed on this slide already, over here on the left-hand side, that once you get here, this problem can be split up into 2 different problems. Oops, I'm ahead of myself here. Let me look. Hang on. Sorry, everybody. Oops, I'm going to go back here. So skip that on that last one. So once we get here, notice I have simplified it down. I have 64 inside underneath the square root symbol, and that's because 144 minus 80 gives me 64. And then I did the square root. So notice the square root symbol is gone. Once you find the square root of a number, then that square root symbol is gone. That's one common mistake people tend to forget about, is a lot of people leave that square root symbol in there, but that is not the case. Okay, before I move on, I'm just going to remind you of the steps. We plugged the numbers in this first line, and then all I'm doing is following order of operations to simplify my expression. So negative 12 squared turned into my 144. 4 times 1 times 20 turned into my 80. And then 2 times 1 turned into 2. And then on the next slide, we'll go back there. On the next slide, I simplified it even further by doing 144 minus 80, and that's where that 64 came from. And again, the rule is you got to simplify it as much as possible. So finding the square root of 64, like I said, is 8. From here, we split this up into two problems. Once that square root symbol is gone, we split it up into 12 plus 8 divided by 2, and we split it up into 12 minus 8 divided by 2. So again, from here, we're splitting it up into the plus and the minus. And then from here, like I said, you just need to keep simplifying. So 12 plus 8 is 20. 20 divided by 2 is 10. 12 minus 8 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So my two solutions for this quadratic equation are 10 and 20. And one thing I forgot to bring back or mention is if you think about when we talked about the discriminant, remember the discriminant is the number that's under the square root symbol. Here we got a positive 64, so we should end up having two solutions. And as we just noticed, we have two separate and distinct numbers. So 10 and 2 would be the solutions for that quadratic equation. Now, I know that this is going to seem kind of, it might seem kind of putsy, meaning take a while for you to do the work, but I am going to ask you that you solve the problem as you see it in this example and simplify the steps as you go with each line, and really pay attention to where those symbols are and where the positives are and the negatives are. Okay, so that's the one example that I have for you. And one thing to think about is how can the quadratic formula help you know the number of solutions you should end up with? Pause, think about that, and write it down. All right, so if you talked about the fact that the discriminant tells you how many solutions there are, you are spot on. A negative discriminant is 0 solutions. A discriminant of 0 means there's 1 solution, and a positive number means there are 2. All right, so you are going to head back into Schoology, and you are going to complete today's worksheet, which is worksheet 7. Please make sure that you are showing your steps just like I showed you in today's example. And if you have questions, you can shoot me an email, or obviously you can check in with me when we have class on Friday again. Okay, so any questions for me, let me know. Otherwise, you are all done with today's lesson, and hopefully you learned about the quadratic formula. And again, if you know Pop Goes the Weasel, you should not ever forget what the quadratic formula is. Have a great day.